The fundamental rights in India are an important part of the Constitution, specifically found in Part 3, covering Articles 12 to 35. The framers of the Indian Constitution took inspiration from the United States Constitution, particularly the Bill of Rights. This part of the Constitution is often referred to as the Magna Carta of India because it lays down essential rights that protect individual freedoms and ensure justice. The fundamental rights in India are extensive and detailed, even more so than those found in any other country, including the United States. These rights are applicable to everyone in the country, ensuring no discrimination. They uphold the principles of equality, individual dignity, and the public's interest while promoting national unity. These rights serve several important purposes. They are designed to support a political democracy in India by preventing the rise of authoritarian rule or tyrannical governance. Essentially, they protect the liberties and freedoms of individuals from being violated by the government. By placing restrictions on government power, these rights act as safeguards against the arbitrary use of authority by those in power. The fundamental rights establish the idea that India should be governed by laws, not by the whims of individuals. They create a framework where citizens can claim their rights and seek justice in case of violations. For instance, Article 14 guarantees the right to equality before the law, and Article 21 provides the right to life and personal liberty. Article 19 grants the right to freedom of speech and expression, assembly, association, movement, residence, and profession. Importantly, these rights are justiciable, meaning individuals can approach the courts to enforce them. The Supreme Court of India, under Article 32, provides a mechanism for citizens to seek enforcement of their fundamental rights, ensuring that the government does not overstep its authority. This judicial protection is crucial for maintaining democracy and the rule of law, making sure that all individuals can live with dignity and freedom. Overall, the fundamental rights in the Indian Constitution not only protect individual freedoms but also serve as a foundation for a just society where the rights of every citizen are respected and upheld. The careful balance between individual rights and governmental powers established by these rights is a hallmark of India's democratic framework. The fundamental rights in India are vital rights that protect individuals and ensure their growth and development in various aspects: material, intellectual, moral, and spiritual. These rights are laid out in the Indian Constitution, which serves as the supreme law of the country. Initially, the Constitution included a total of 7 fundamental rights, which are: right to equality, Articles 14 to 18, right to freedom, Articles 19 to 22, right against exploitation, Articles 23 to 24, right to freedom of religion, Articles 25 to 28, cultural and educational rights, Articles 29 to 30, right to property, Article 31, right to constitutional remedies, Article 1932. However, during the 44th Amendment Act in 1978, the right to property was removed from the list of fundamental rights. It was reclassified as a legal right under Article 300-A in Part 12 of the Constitution. Now, there are 6 fundamental rights recognized in India. These fundamental rights provide various protections to the citizens of India. Some of these rights are specific to Indian citizens, while others are extended to all individuals within the country, including foreigners and legal entities such as corporations. The rights available to foreigners form a select portion of these rights as well. Although these rights are essential, they are not absolute. The state has the authority to impose reasonable restrictions on them for the sake of public order and other necessary considerations. The courts have the power to determine whether these restrictions are indeed reasonable. This balancing act helps ensure both individual freedoms and social responsibilities. The fundamental rights can be enforced against the arbitrary actions of the state. In some instances, they also offer protection against the actions of ordinary individuals. Some rights are negative in nature, meaning they restrict state authority, while others are positive, granting specific privileges. Importantly, individuals can seek legal recourse through the courts if these rights are violated. The Supreme Court plays a crucial role in upholding these rights and providing justice to the aggrieved parties. Under Article 32, individuals have the right to approach the Supreme Court directly without needing to appeal from lower courts. Though fundamental rights are critical, they are not unchangeable. The Parliament can amend, curtail, or even repeal these rights through the constitutional amendment process, but this cannot be done through regular legislation. Any such amendments must not undermine the basic structure of the Constitution, which is a doctrine established by the Supreme Court to protect the core principles of the Constitution. During a national emergency, most of the fundamental rights can be suspended, with the exception of the rights guaranteed by Articles 20 and 21, which protect against arbitrary arrests and ensure the right to life, respectively. The scope of rights guaranteed by Article 19, which includes freedom of speech and expression, assembly, association, movement, residence, and profession, can be automatically restricted during emergencies declared due to war or external aggression, but not during a situation of internal rebellion. Additionally, certain other constitutional articles limit the operation of fundamental rights. For example, Article 31 allows savings for laws that provide for acquiring estates, while Article 31b includes validation for specific acts listed in the 9th schedule. Article 33 grants Parliament the power to restrict or revoke the application of these rights to members of armed forces, paramilitary forces, and police during times of martial law, as provided under Article 34. This martial law may be declared in circumstances requiring military governance to restore order. Most fundamental rights are directly enforceable, but some require specific legislation for their implementation. The responsibility for creating such laws rests solely with Parliament to ensure uniformity across the country, as stated in Article 35. In summary, fundamental rights are a cornerstone of Indian democracy, ensuring the protection and growth of individuals while also maintaining a balance with the collective rights of society. These rights, along with their responsibilities and limitations, constitute a major aspect of the Constitution's role in Indian governance. In India, intelligence agencies and services that work to maintain national security have specific rules that can be changed or removed by the Parliament, as stated in Article 33 of the Constitution. This means that the Parliament has the authority to decide how these agencies operate and ensure that they align with the country's needs, especially during challenging times. An important context for these operations is often martial law. Martial law is a situation where the military takes control over the normal functioning of a government, usually during extreme circumstances when law and order has broken down. This is different from a national emergency, which is declared when there is a significant threat to the nation from outside or internal disturbances, as provided under Article 352 of the Constitution. When martial law is declared in a certain area, the normal rules for intelligence agencies can be restricted or adjusted to ensure safety and restore order, according to Article 34. Most of the rules concerning these agencies can be enforced directly without requiring additional laws. However, some rules need a law to be created to be put into practice. Only the Parliament can make these laws, not the state legislatures. This is important for maintaining a uniform approach across all states in India, which is outlined in Article 35 of the Constitution. This ensures that the same standards and procedures apply nationwide, preventing any variations that could complicate law enforcement and national security operations. Overall, while intelligence agencies play a crucial role in protecting the country, the laws governing them are carefully structured within the framework of the Indian Constitution to balance security needs with individual rights and freedoms. The Parliament's role in regulating these agencies emphasizes the importance of accountability and uniformity in the enforcement of laws related to national security. Laws inconsistent with fundamental rights in India. In India, Article 13 of the Constitution outlines an important principle regarding laws that go against fundamental rights. This article states that any law that is not in line with or violates the fundamental rights provided by the Constitution is considered void or invalid. This means that if a law contradicts the fundamental rights guaranteed to citizens, it cannot be enforced. This provision establishes the principle of judicial review, which allows courts to review laws and determine if they are constitutional. The power to perform this judicial review is given to the Supreme Court of India, as stated in Article 32 of the Constitution, and to the High Courts, mentioned in Article 226. When there is a case in which a law is believed to infringe on a fundamental right, individuals can approach these higher courts, which have the authority to declare the law unconstitutional. The term law, as mentioned in Article 13, covers a broad range of legal sources. It includes permanent laws. These are the laws created by the Parliament or the state legislatures that are meant to last indefinitely unless amended or repealed. Temporary laws. This includes ordinances, which are temporary laws issued by the President of India or state governors. These are typically used in situations where immediate action is required and the Parliament is not in session. Statutory instruments. These refer to various forms of delegated legislation, which means laws that are made by an authority under powers given to them by an existing law. This can include orders, rules, regulations, and notifications. Non-legislative sources. This includes customs or usages that have gained the force of law due to long-standing practices in society. Because of the broad definition of what constitutes a law, individuals can challenge any of these forms in court if they feel that their fundamental rights are being violated. However, there is an important exception noted in Article 13. Constitutional amendments are not regarded as laws and, therefore, cannot generally be challenged in court. But the landmark Keswananda Bharati case, decided in 1973, changed the understanding of this exception. The Supreme Court ruled that while constitutional amendments themselves cannot be challenged directly as laws, they can be reviewed if it is argued that they violate a fundamental right that forms part of the basic structure of the Constitution. This decision established a crucial principle: while Parliament can amend the Constitution, it cannot alter its core framework and the fundamental rights that protect citizens. In summary, Articles 13, 32, and 226 of the Indian Constitution collectively play a vital role in ensuring that all laws adhere to the fundamental rights enshrined in the Constitution, empowering citizens and the judiciary to uphold these rights against inconsistent laws. Right to equality in India. The right to equality is a fundamental principle in the Indian Constitution that aims to ensure that all individuals are treated equally before the law. This principle is primarily outlined in Article 14, which states that everyone in India, whether citizens or foreigners, should have equal protection and equality before the law. This means that no individual can be discriminated against or given special privileges due to their race, religion, gender, or status. The term person in this context also includes corporations and other legal entities, not just individuals. The concept of equality before the law has its roots in British law, while equal protection of the laws is borrowed from the American Constitution. The idea behind equality before the law is that everyone is subject to the same laws and no one is above the law, irrespective of whether they are rich or poor, a government official or a private citizen. On the other hand, Equal protection of the laws means that similar individuals in similar situations should be treated the same way by the law without any unfair discrimination. However, equality does not mean that everyone must be treated identically under all circumstances. The Supreme Court of India has clarified that while Article 14 prohibits discriminatory or arbitrary treatment, it allows for reasonable classification. This means laws can make distinctions among different groups of people or things, but such distinctions must be logical and significant, rather than random or unjust. Another important concept related to equality is the rule of law, which was introduced by British jurist A.V. Dicey. According to him, the rule of law consists of three main elements. No person can be punished except for violating the law. All citizens are equal under the law, which is administered fairly without favoritism. Individual rights are fundamental, derived from the law rather than granted by the Constitution. In India, the first two elements of the rule of law are fully applicable, while the idea of individual rights being defined by the Constitution is more prominent. Article 14 is considered a basic feature of the Constitution, meaning it cannot be changed or removed even through constitutional amendments. While the right to equality is a significant aspect of Indian democracy, it is important to note that there are exceptions. For instance, Article 361 provides certain immunities for the President of India and state governors. These officials cannot be prosecuted in courts for actions performed as part of their duties during their term in office. They also cannot be arrested or face civil lawsuits until 2 months after leaving office. Another exception is found in Article 105 and Article 194, which protect members of Parliament and state legislators, respectively, from legal action regarding statements made in the legislature. Additionally, Article 31-C allows certain laws made to implement the directive principles of state policy to not be contested under Article 14, thereby providing special protection in those cases. Foreign sovereigns, diplomats, and certain international organizations such as the United Nations also enjoy specific legal immunities, which means they are not subject to the same legal processes in India. In conclusion, the right to equality, primarily enshrined in Article 14 of the Indian Constitution, serves as a cornerstone of democracy and justice in India. It underscores the country's commitment to fair and equal treatment for all individuals while allowing for some exceptions under defined circumstances. Understanding these principles is essential for appreciating the legal framework that governs equality in India. Prohibition of discrimination under Article 15 of the Indian Constitution. Article 15 of the Indian Constitution is a significant law designed to prevent discrimination against any citizen based on specific factors such as religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth. The key terms in this article are discrimination and only. Discrimination means to treat someone unfavorably compared to others, while the term only indicates that the article focuses on these particular grounds for discrimination, allowing for other forms of differentiation. In its second part, Article 15 extends protection by stating that no citizen should face any barriers, restrictions, or hardships concerning access to public amenities and resources on the same grounds. This encompasses places such as shops, restaurants, hotels, and other public entertainment venues. Moreover, it covers the use of public facilities like wells, tanks, bathing ghats, and roads, particularly those funded by the state or meant for public use. Importantly, this provision stops discrimination from both the state, government, and private individuals. Exceptions to non-discrimination. However, there are some exceptions to this rule, allowing the state to make specific provisions to promote the welfare of certain groups. Firstly, the state can create special programs for women and children. For instance, reserving seats for women in local governance bodies or offering free education to children fall under this category. Secondly, provisions can be made for the upliftment of socially and educationally backward classes, which includes scheduled castes, SCs, and scheduled tribes, STs. This can be seen in the reservation of seats or concessions in fees at public educational institutions. Thirdly, special provisions can also be made for admitting students from these backward classes into educational institutions. This includes both government-funded and private institutions, but it excludes minority institutions. Lastly, the law allows the state to reserve up to 10% of seats for economically weaker sections, EWS, in educational institutions, adding to existing reservations. The government identifies families as EWS based on income and other socio-economic factors. Educational reservations for OBCs. The provisions mentioned above were strengthened by the 93rd Amendment Act of 2005, leading to the creation of a quota in educational institutions. This amendment led to the Central Educational Institutions Reservation in Admission Act 2006, which reserves a 27% quota for other backward classes, OBCs, in central higher educational institutions, including prestigious ones like the Indian Institutes of Technology, IITs, and the Indian Institutes of Management, IIMs. In April 2008, the Supreme Court upheld this act but instructed the government to exclude the creamy layer, essentially the more advanced segments within the OBC, from these quotas. The creamy layer encompasses individuals in high-ranking jobs or who possess significant wealth, such as constitutional office holders, senior government officers, military personnel of a certain rank, and other professionals with substantial income. Economic reservation for EWS. The 103rd Amendment Act of 2019 included provisions for EWS, allowing for an additional 10% reservation in educational admissions for those who do not benefit from existing quotas for SCs, STs, and OBCs. Eligibility for this reservation is based on family income, specifically those with a gross annual income of less than 8 lakhs rupees, which includes all sources of income. However, individuals are excluded from this classification if their family owns significant assets, like large plots of agricultural land or spacious residential properties. For determining eligibility, properties across various locations are aggregated, and the definition of family includes the applicant, their parents, siblings under 18, and any children under the same age. Conclusion. In summary, Article 15 serves as a cornerstone in the Indian Constitution aimed at balancing social equity by prohibiting discrimination. While it mandates equal treatment, it also allows flexibility for specific provisions targeted toward disadvantaged groups to ensure their advancement. The intricate details related to reservations for OBCs and EWS provide a broader understanding of how India is striving to achieve social and economic justice through legislative measures. The government's acceptance and implementation of these provisions underscore India's commitment to inclusivity, ensuring that all citizens can access opportunities for growth and development. Equality of opportunity in public employment. Article 16 of the Indian Constitution ensures that all citizens have equal opportunities for employment or positions under the state. It clearly states that no one should be treated unfairly or be denied a job based solely on their religion, race, caste, sex, ancestry, or where they were born or live. However, there are specific exceptions to this rule where certain conditions can apply. One exception allows the Parliament to require that certain jobs have residency requirements. This means that for some positions in a state or union territory, a person might have to live there for a specified time to be eligible. In India, this requirement has been almost completely abolished, with only Andhra Pradesh and Telangana continuing to enforce it based on certain laws. Another exception allows the government to reserve jobs for specific groups that haven't been fairly represented in public employment. This means that certain percentages of jobs can be set aside for these backward classes, scheduled castes, SCs, and scheduled tribes, STs. The government can also reserve places for promotions, ensuring that these groups can advance in their careers. Notably, if there are reserved job openings that weren't filled in a given year, they may be carried over to subsequent years without counting against the total percentage of reservations for that year. Furthermore, the constitutional framework allows laws to be made so that jobs related to religious institutions can only be filled by people of a specific religion. This means that if an office is related to a particular faith, those who govern it or work in it may have to belong to that religion. More recently, a provision for reserving up to 10% of jobs for the economically weaker sections, EWS, of society was introduced to help those who are economically disadvantaged and do not fall under existing reservation categories like SCs, STs, and other backward classes, OBCs. The eligibility criteria for this new reservation are determined by the government based on family income and other measures of economic status. The Mandal Commission and its recommendations. In 1979, the Indian government established the Second Backward Classes Commission, led by B.P. Mandal, to investigate the status of socially and educationally backward classes. This commission identified about 3,743 castes that fell into this category, which accounted for almost 52% of the population, excluding SCs and STs. The Commission recommended that 27% of government jobs be reserved for OBCs, which would bring the total reservation for these groups, including SCs, STs, and OBCs, to 50%. It wasn't until 1990 that the government began implementing this reservation. In 1991, additional provisions were introduced, allowing for reservation based on economic status and designating another 10% of jobs for other economically backward sections. The Supreme Court, in the 1992 Indira Sahni case, affirmed the legality of this reservation system but imposed certain conditions. These conditions required that more affluent members of OBCs, known as the creamy layer, be excluded from benefits and that reservations should primarily apply to initial job appointments rather than promotions. Additionally, the court ruled that no more than 50% of positions could be reserved, except in extraordinary circumstances. Following the Supreme Court's ruling, several legislative amendments were made. For instance, the Ram Nandan Committee was established to identify the creamy layer within OBCs. This led to the creation of the National Commission for Backward Classes in 1993, which was given constitutional status in 2018 through the 102nd Amendment Act, allowing it to address issues of inclusion or exclusion among OBCs. Furthermore, the 77th Amendment Act in 1995 enabled the state to reserve jobs and promotions for SCs and STs, and subsequent amendments further refined these provisions. Notably, the 81st Amendment Act in 2000 allowed unfilled reserved vacancies from 1 year to be considered separately for future hiring, thereby not counting against the 50% reservation limit. Legal measures have also been taken to protect reservations from judicial challenges, inspiring various amendments like the 76th Amendment Act, which recognized Tamil Nadu's legislation for reservations that exceed the 50% limit. Reservation for economically weaker sections, EWS. The 103rd Amendment Act of 2019 introduced a significant change by allowing 10% reservations for the economically weaker sections in civil service positions. This reservation applies to individuals who are not included in existing reservation categories. The government has now set specific criteria for this group, ensuring that those who are deemed economically disadvantaged can avail themselves of these opportunities. However, it is essential to note that scientific and technical positions may be exempted from this reservation if they meet certain conditions, such as requiring advanced knowledge in specific fields and being involved in research roles. In summary, Article 16 and its related amendments reflect India's commitment to promote equality and fairness in public employment while recognizing the need to uplift historically marginalized communities. The ongoing adjustments and enhancements to the reservation system illustrate the country's efforts to adapt to changing social dynamics and economic realities. Abolition of untouchability. In India, Article 17 of the Constitution plays a crucial role in promoting social equality by abolishing the practice of untouchability. Untouchability is a form of social discrimination that has affected certain groups, particularly those belonging to specific castes, for many years. With the introduction of Article 17, the Indian Constitution explicitly forbids untouchability and considers any act of discrimination or exclusion due to this practice as an offence punishable by law. In 1976, the Indian government amended the Untouchability Offences Act, 1955. The amendment resulted in the Act being renamed the Protection of Civil Rights Act, 1955. This change was significant as it broadened the scope of the law, providing more severe penalties for violations related to untouchability. Within this Act, a civil right is defined as any right that a person is entitled to because of the abolition of untouchability as guaranteed by Article 17. Interestingly, while Article 17 and the Protection of Civil Rights Act speak about untouchability, neither of them provides a specific definition for the term. In a judgment made by the Mysore High Court, it was clarified that Article 17 does not refer to untouchability in a strict literal sense. Instead, it concerns the historical practice of untouchability as it has developed in Indian society. This implies that untouchability involves the social disabilities imposed on individuals based on their birth in particular castes. Therefore, the article does not apply to instances where individuals might be socially boycotted or excluded from religious practices due to personal reasons rather than caste. The Supreme Court of India also addressed the application of Article 17 in the case known as the People's Union for Democratic Rights case in 1982. The court ruled that the rights established under Article 17 apply not just in public settings but are also enforceable against private individuals. This means that it is a responsibility of the state to take action and protect these rights, ensuring that no one is discriminated against based on the untouchability practice. Overall, the abolition of untouchability, backed by Article 17 of the Indian Constitution and reinforced by subsequent legal frameworks, marks an important step towards achieving social justice and equality in India. The ongoing commitment to enforcing these rights is vital in creating a more inclusive society free from discrimination and prejudice. Abolition of titles in India. Article 18 of the Indian Constitution is an important law that abolishes the use of titles in India, aiming to promote equality among all citizens. This article lays down four main rules regarding titles. First, the Government of India cannot give out any titles to people, whether they are citizens or foreigners, unless they are military or academic honors. This means that things like titles of nobility, which were used in the colonial era, cannot be given anymore. Second, Indian citizens are not allowed to accept any titles from other countries. This rule helps to ensure that all citizens maintain their equality without being distinguished by foreign honors. Third, if a foreigner holds a government position in India, like a job that involves profit or trust, they cannot receive any titles from their home country without getting permission from the President of India. This rule ensures that foreign officials do not take undue influence or honor from their home nations while they are serving in India. Fourth, no one, whether a citizen or a foreigner in a government position, can accept gifts or benefits from foreign states without approval from the President. This provision helps maintain integrity and ensures that individuals in important roles prioritize their duties to the Indian state without outside influences. With these rules in mind, Article 18 effectively eliminates hereditary titles that were once given out during British rule, such as Maharaja, Raj Bahadur, Rai Sahab, and Dewan Bahadur. These titles promote a hierarchy, which goes against the principle that everyone is equal. In a significant court case in 1995, known as the Balaji Raghavan case, the Supreme Court of India reaffirmed the legality of certain awards, such as the Bharat Ratna and the Padma Awards, Padma Vibhushan, Padma Bhushan, and Padma Shri. The court ruled that these awards do not count as titles under Article 18, which specifically targets hereditary titles. The Supreme Court indicated that recognizing merit is important and does not contradict the equality principle. However, the court specified that recipients of these awards should not add them as prefixes or suffixes to their names. If they do so, they risk losing the awards. The Padma Awards were first introduced in 1954, but they faced a discontinuation under the Janata Party government led by Morarji Desai in 1977. However, the awards were reinstated in 1980 by Indira Gandhi's government. These awards are typically announced every year on Republic Day, with some interruptions between 1978 to 1979 and from 1993 to 1997. The number of Padma Awards given in any year is capped at 120, excluding posthumous honors or awards given to non-resident Indians, NRIs, foreigners, or overseas citizens of India, OCIs. Similarly, the Bharat Ratna, which is India's highest civilian award, is limited to a maximum of 3 recipients each year. In summary, Article 18 serves to uphold the ideals of equality in India by prohibiting the conferment and acceptance of titles that can create social hierarchies, while still recognizing exceptional contributions to society through awards that do not violate this principle. The right to freedom in India. The right to freedom is a fundamental principle enshrined in the Indian Constitution, specifically under Article 19. This article guarantees 6 essential rights to all Indian citizens. These rights significantly contribute to personal freedom and expression within the country, and they are designed to ensure that citizens can live and move freely. Here are the 6 rights protected under Article 19. Right to freedom of speech and expression. Every citizen has the right to express their thoughts and opinions freely through various means such as speaking, writing, or media. This right allows individuals to communicate their ideas and engage in discussions. The Supreme Court of India has extended this right, including aspects like the freedom of the press, the right to peaceful protests, and the ability to share information online, among others. Right to assemble peaceably and without arms. Citizens have the right to gather peacefully to express their views or protest. However, this assembly must be unarmed and must not disturb public peace. The government can impose restrictions on this right, particularly if there is a risk to public safety or order, as stated in Section 144 of the Criminal Procedure Code. Right to form associations. This right allows citizens to organize themselves into groups such as unions, clubs, or political parties. People can join together for collective activities or causes. However, forming associations for illegal activities or purposes considered immoral can be restricted. Right to move freely. Citizens can travel anywhere within the country, allowing for a sense of unity among diverse states. The government can restrict movement in certain areas to protect the interests of specific groups, particularly scheduled tribes, to preserve their culture and identity. This right allows for internal travel but does not cover international movement, which is addressed under Article 21. Right to reside and settle. Citizens have the freedom to live in any part of the country. This right aims to create a sense of belonging and unity by reducing barriers across states. Just like movement, this right can be limited in certain contexts, especially in areas inhabited by scheduled tribes to safeguard their traditions and way of life. Right to practice any profession or carry on any trade or business. Everyone has the freedom to pursue any profession as long as it is legal. This right is crucial for economic independence and personal livelihood. The government may impose regulations and qualifications for specific professions to ensure public safety and welfare. Originally, Article 19 included a seventh right, the right to own property. However, this was removed by the 44th Amendment Act in 1978. It is important to note that these rights are protected against actions taken by the state and not against individuals in private settings. Also, these rights are exclusive to citizens. Foreigners and corporations do not have the same privileges. The state is allowed to impose reasonable restrictions on these rights based on the grounds mentioned in Article 19. These grounds include the security of the state, public order, decency, and morality. For example, while citizens can express their opinions freely, this can be limited if it poses a threat to public safety or national integrity. The right to freedom of speech and expression is one of the most debated rights. Over the years, various Supreme Court judgments have broadened its interpretation, including the right to know about government actions, the right to demonstrate peacefully, and the right to express gender identity. However, this freedom comes with the responsibility not to violate laws regarding defamation, contempt of court, or incitement to violence. The right to assemble allows for peaceful gatherings but is subject to restrictions if the assembly turns violent or disrupts public order. The government may use laws to disperse gatherings if they threaten public safety. When it comes to the right to associate, individuals can form partnerships or unions, but the state can impose rules to avoid any conflicts with national integrity and public order. The right to move freely and the right to reside are crucial for creating a united national identity in a diverse country like India. However, restrictions may apply to protect the interests of scheduled tribes or manage public safety in specific contexts. Lastly, the right to profession is vital for economic activity. The government can regulate certain professions and impose standards or qualifications to ensure public welfare. In conclusion, Article 19 of the Indian Constitution secures vital freedoms that allow citizens to express themselves, organize together, travel, reside, and earn a living. These rights are fundamental to ensure that democracy thrives in the country, always balancing between individual freedom and public interest. Understanding these freedoms and their limitations helps foster a responsible exercise of rights while promoting harmony and respect for the law. Protection regarding crime convictions in India. Article 20 of the Indian Constitution provides important protections for individuals who are accused of crimes. This means that whether someone is a citizen of India, a foreigner, or a corporation, they cannot be treated unfairly or excessively punished in a legal setting. Article 20 contains three main protections aimed at ensuring justice. No ex post facto laws. The first protection is against ex post facto laws. These are laws that would punish someone for an action that was not illegal when it was carried out. In simpler terms, if a person commits an act that is not against the law at that time, they cannot later be punished if new laws are created that make that act a crime. Also, if a new law increases the punishment for a crime after it has already been committed, that too cannot be applied. This rule is designed specifically for criminal laws and does not apply to civil laws or tax laws. Therefore, if someone owes taxes, the government can apply new tax laws retroactively, but they cannot punish someone for a crime based on a new law that was introduced after the act. Protection against double jeopardy. The second protection in Article 20 states that no person should be tried and punished for the same crime more than once. This means if a person has already been found guilty or not guilty of a particular crime, they cannot be prosecuted again for that same crime in a court of law. However, this protection applies only in formal judicial settings and not in cases handled by administrative departments or other non-judicial bodies. No self-incrimination. The third provision protects individuals from being forced to provide evidence that could be used against them. In simpler terms, a person cannot be compelled to testify against themselves in a court of law. This protection covers verbal testimonies and written documents. However, it does not include things like the requirement to submit physical evidence or provide biological samples, such as blood or fingerprints. Again, this protection is only applicable to criminal cases and does not extend to civil cases. These protections ensure that everyone receives a fair trial and that the legal procedures in India are just and transparent. They help prevent abuse of power by authorities and safeguard individual rights, supporting the principle that it is better for a guilty person to go unpunished than for an innocent person to be wrongly convicted. Article 20 serves as a crucial part of the fundamental rights guaranteed by the Constitution of India, ensuring a balance between the need for law enforcement and the rights of individuals. Protection of life and personal liberty under Article 21 of the Indian Constitution. Article 21 of the Indian Constitution plays a crucial role in safeguarding every individual's right to life and personal liberty. It clearly states that no person should be deprived of life or personal liberty unless it follows a legal procedure. This right is granted to everyone in the country, regardless of whether they are citizens or not. In the landmark case, Gopalan v. State of Madras, in 1950, the Supreme Court provided a narrow interpretation of Article 21. The court ruled that this article only protected individuals from arbitrary actions taken by the executive, such as government officials, and not from arbitrary laws passed by the legislature. This means that if a law exists, it can limit someone's right to life and personal liberty, as long as the law prescribes a procedure. The key phrase here is procedure established by law. This differs from the concept of due process of law in the American Constitution, which protects individuals against unfair or unreasonable laws. Therefore, according to the Supreme Court's interpretation at that time, a law that follows a procedure cannot be challenged merely because it seems unfair or unjust. Furthermore, in this interpretation, personal liberty was viewed quite narrowly, primarily concerning a person's physical body. However, in an important shift, the Supreme Court revisited its decision in the Maneka Gandhi v. Union of India case in 1978. The court adopted a broader interpretation of Article 21, stating that the right to life and personal liberty can only be taken away if the process laid out by the law is reasonable, fair, and just. It also emphasized that the procedure must conform to the principles of natural justice, similar to the American understanding of due process. As a result, Article 21's protections were extended not only against arbitrary executive actions but also against unjust legislative actions. The court further clarified that the right to life in Article 21 is not just about survival, it encompasses the right to live with dignity and to pursue a meaningful life. According to its interpretation, the term personal liberty has a broad scope that includes various rights essential for an individual's freedom. Over the years, the Supreme Court has recognized numerous rights as part of Article 21, including but not limited to right to live with dignity, right to a clean environment, including access to safe water and air, right to earn a livelihood, right to privacy, right to adequate shelter, right to health care, right to free education for children up to the age of 14, right to free legal aid, right to protection from solitary confinement, right to a quick trial, Additionally, rights such as the right not to be subjected to inhumane treatment, the right to proper medical care, and the right to a fair trial have also been recognized. The court has continuously expanded the protections under Article 21, recognizing the importance of various life aspects that contribute to a person's dignity and humanity. Key cases that have influenced the development of Article 21's interpretation include Keswananda Bharati vs. State of Kerala, 1973, which established the basic structure doctrine. Husainara Khatun vs. State of Bihar, 1979, which highlighted the right to speedy trials. Puttaswamy vs. Union of India, 2017, which recognized the right to privacy as intrinsic to life and personal liberty. Each of these landmark rulings has built upon the original premise of Article 21, ensuring that the rights to life and personal liberty are not just legal provisions but are embedded deeply in the fabric of individual dignity and freedom in India. The dynamic nature of Article 21 illustrates its pivotal role in upholding human rights within the constitutional framework of the country. Right to education in India. The right to education is an essential part of India's constitution, specifically stated in Article 21A. This article says that the government must provide free and compulsory education to all children aged between 6 and 14 years. This is a significant step as it establishes only elementary education as a fundamental right, meaning that the government has to ensure this right is upheld. However, it does not extend to higher education or professional courses like engineering or medicine. This important change was made through the 86th Constitutional Amendment Act in 2002. The government hailed this amendment as a significant moment in the journey towards achieving education for all in the country. They described it as the beginning of a second revolution in the rights of citizens. Before this amendment was added, Article 45 in Part 4 of the Constitution included provisions for free and compulsory education for children. However, this was part of the directive principles of state policy, which are guidelines for the government and cannot be enforced by courts. The 86th Amendment changed this situation, allowing for more judicial control over educational rights. After the amendment, Article 45 was also modified. It now states that the government should work towards providing early childhood care and education to all children until they are 6 years old. Furthermore, a new fundamental duty was added for citizens in Article 51A. This states that every citizen of India has the responsibility to ensure educational opportunities for their child or ward between the ages of 6 and 14 years. The importance of education has been emphasized in various Supreme Court rulings. For instance, in the Unni Krishnan case, 1993, the Supreme Court recognized a fundamental right to primary education as part of the right to life guaranteed under Article 21. The court ruled that every child has the right to free education until the age of 14, after which the right to education may depend on the state's financial capacity and development. This ruling overrode an earlier decision in the Mohini Jain case, 1992, which suggested that the right to education extended to all levels, including professional education. Following the establishment of Article 21, the Parliament enacted the Right of Children to Free and Compulsory Education (RTE) Act in 2009. This act aims to ensure that every child receives full-time elementary education of good quality in a formal school. The schools must meet specific norms and standards, promoting values such as equality, social justice, and democracy. These principles are believed to be foundational for creating a fair and caring society. Both the 86th Amendment and the RTE Act came into effect on 1 April 2010. They represent a committed effort by the Indian government to improve access to education for all children, making it a priority in national development and social justice. Through these legislative changes, the state not only acknowledges the right to education but also seeks to fulfill it through well-defined laws and commitments. In summary, the right to education is a crucial part of India's constitution, aimed at ensuring that all children have access to basic education. This commitment is reinforced through various laws and judicial interpretations, highlighting the importance of education as a fundamental right in building a just and equitable society. Protection against arrest and detention. Article 22 of the Indian Constitution offers protections to individuals who are arrested or detained. It defines two main types of detention: punitive and preventive. Punitive detention serves to punish someone for a crime after they have been tried and found guilty in court. In contrast, preventive detention involves keeping someone in custody without trial to stop them from committing potential offenses in the future. This type of detention is more about taking precautions based on suspicion rather than punishing past actions. Article 22 is divided into two sections. The first section pertains to regular law, while the second section deals with preventive detention. Rights under ordinary law. The first section of Article 22 provides several important rights to anyone who is arrested or detained under ordinary laws. These rights are crucial for ensuring a fair legal process. Right to information. A person under arrest must be informed of the reasons for their arrest. Right to legal advice. They have the right to consult and be represented by a lawyer. Right to be presented before a magistrate. A person must be brought before a magistrate within 24 hours of arrest, excluding the time taken for travel. Right to release. If the magistrate does not give permission for further detention, the person must be released after 24 hours. However, these rights do not apply to enemy aliens, foreign nationals considered a threat, or individuals detained under preventive detention laws. The Supreme Court has clarified that the protections in this part of Article 22 do not cover arrests made by court orders, such as civil arrests, arrests for failing to pay taxes, or deportations of foreigners. They are applicable only in criminal cases or situations that could harm public interest. Rights under preventive detention laws. The second part of Article 22 offers protections for those detained under preventive detention laws. This protection is available to citizens and foreigners alike, and it includes the following rights. Maximum detention duration. If someone is detained under preventive laws, their detention cannot last more than 3 months unless a special advisory board, made up of High Court judges, agrees that longer detention is justified. Communication of grounds for detention. The reasons for detention must be communicated to the detained individual, although any information deemed sensitive for public interest may not be shared. Opportunity to challenge detention. The detained person has the right to make a representation or appeal against the order of detention. Furthermore, Article 22 empowers the Parliament to establish rules regarding preventive detention, including the circumstances under which a person can be detained for more than 3 months without the advisory board's opinion. It also allows Parliament to set a maximum duration for detention in specific cases and outline the procedures for the advisory board's inquiries. Amendments and legislative powers. The 44th Amendment Act of 1978 aimed to modify the law by reducing the maximum period for detention without advisory board opinion from 3 months to 2 months. However, this amendment has not been enacted yet. Hence, the original 3-month rule remains in effect. The Constitution shares the legislative authority for preventive detention between Parliament and state legislatures. Parliament can create laws related to national security, defense, and foreign affairs. Both Parliament and state governments can legislate on matters concerning state security, public order, and essential community services. Several laws have been enacted by Parliament regarding preventive detention, such as Preventive Detention Act, 1950. This law expired in 1969. This law expired in 1969. Maintenance of Internal Security Act, MISA, 1971, repealed in 1978. Repealed in 1978. Conservation of Foreign Exchange and Prevention of Smuggling Activities Act, COFEPOSA, 1974. National Security Act, NASA, 1980. Prevention of Black Marketing and Maintenance of Supplies of Essential Commodities Act, PBMSEK, 1980. Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Prevention Act, TADA, 1985, repealed in 1995. Repealed in 1995. Prevention of Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act, PITIN-PSA, 1988. Prevention of Terrorism Act, POTA, 2002, repealed in 2004. Repealed in 2004. Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, UAPA, 1967, which has seen amendments in 2004, 2008, 2012, and 2019. It is noteworthy that preventive detention as an essential aspect of constitutional law is quite unique to India. Unlike in the United States, where preventive detention is not part of the legal framework, its use in Britain was largely limited to wartime efforts during the First and Second World Wars. Even during British rule in India, preventive detention was practiced, with laws like the Bengal State Prisoners Regulation of 1818 and the Defence of India Act of 1939 paving the way for such measures. This historical context highlights the ongoing complexity and relevance of preventive detention within the Indian legal system. Right against exploitation. In India, the right against exploitation is an important part of the constitution that aims to protect individuals from various forms of abuse and unfair treatment at work and in society. This protection is primarily contained in Article 23 of the Indian Constitution. Article 23 clearly states that certain practices are not allowed. It forbids traffic in human beings, which means the buying and selling of people like they are objects. This includes serious issues such as prostitution of women and children, practices related to Devdasis, and any form of slavery. When the Constitution talks about traffic in human beings, it is ensuring that no individual, whether a citizen or a foreigner, should be treated as merchandise. The Constitution also prevents begar or forced labor. Begar refers to a historical practice in India where landlords would force their tenants to work for them without any payment. This type of compulsory work is unacceptable, and Article 23 ensures that it won't happen in modern society. The term forced labor means making someone work against their will. This includes not only physical violence or legal threats but also situations where economic pressures force someone to accept low wages, which is less than the minimum wage set by law. To address these issues comprehensively, the Parliament of India has enacted several laws. For instance, the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act, 1956 is aimed at combating human trafficking and preventing exploitation through immoral activities. Similarly, the Bonded Labor System Abolition Act, 1976 seeks to abolish bonded labor, a practice where individuals are forced to work to pay off a debt. Other relevant laws include the Minimum Wages Act, 1948, which sets the minimum pay for different kinds of labor, the Contract Labor Regulation and Abolition Act, 1970, which regulates the conditions of employment for contract workers, and the Equal Remuneration Act, 1976, which mandates equal pay for equal work done by men and women. However, Article 23 does allow for an exception. The state can require people to serve in certain compulsory roles for public purposes, such as military service or social service. In these cases, the state does not have to provide payment. Importantly, while the state can impose this kind of service, they cannot discriminate against people based on religion, race, caste, or social class. Overall, the right against exploitation in India is a significant constitutional provision aimed at protecting individuals from severe forms of abuse. It not only provides legal protection by prohibiting trafficking and forced labor but also ensures that laws are in place to uphold these rights, reflecting India's commitment to human dignity and social justice. Prohibition of child employment in India. In India, there are strict rules against employing children in harmful jobs. Article 24 of the Indian Constitution clearly states that children under the age of 14 cannot be employed in factories, mines, or any dangerous activities, such as construction work or working on railways. However, this article does allow for children to be involved in light or harmless jobs, which do not pose a threat to their health or safety. To support this constitutional provision, the Child Labour, Prohibition and Regulation Act, 1986 was introduced as the main law regulating child labour in the country. This act builds on earlier laws including the Employment of Children Act, 1938, the Factories Act, 1948, the Mines Act, 1952, the Merchant Shipping Act, 1958, the Plantation Labour Act, 1951, the Motor Transport Workers Act, 1951, the Apprentices Act, 1961, and the Bidi and Cigar Workers Act, 1966. Each of these laws has guidelines that prevent the employment of children below a specific age in various sectors. In 1996, a significant ruling by the Supreme Court of India led to the creation of the Child Labour Rehabilitation Welfare Fund. This ruling stated that any employer found to be employing children would have to pay a fine of 20,000 rupees for each child they employed. This fine is meant to discourage child labor and promote better living standards for these children. Additionally, the Supreme Court highlighted the importance of improving children's education, health, and nutrition. In 2005, the Commissions for Protection of Child Rights Act was passed to establish the National Commission and State Commissions for Protection of Child Rights. This act also set up children's courts that are designed to deal quickly with cases involving child rights violations or offences against children, ensuring that any wrongdoings are addressed without delay. In 2006, the Indian government took further steps by banning the employment of children as domestic workers and in establishments like hotels, restaurants, shops, factories, resorts, spas, and tea shops. The law makes it clear that anyone employing a child under the age of 14 will face legal consequences. More recently, in 2016, the Child Labour, Prohibition and Regulation Amendment Act was enacted, which updated the original 1986 Act. This amendment expanded the definition of child labour, officially renaming the Act to the Child and Adolescent Labour, Prohibition and Regulation Act, 1986. The changes made under this Act reflect a commitment to not just banning child labour, but also preventing adolescent labour and ensuring that children have access to opportunities for education and development. Overall, India has made significant progress in establishing laws and regulations to protect children from exploitation, ensuring a healthier and safer environment for their growth and development. Right to freedom of religion. The right to freedom of religion in India is primarily governed by Article 25 of the Indian Constitution. This article assures that every person has the right to hold their own beliefs and to practice their religion freely. It encapsulates several important aspects of religious freedom. Firstly, freedom of conscience refers to the inner personal freedom that allows an individual to determine their relationship with God or a higher power in any way they choose. This means that everyone is free to believe what they feel is right without any external pressure. Secondly, the right to profess allows individuals to declare their religious beliefs openly. This means that you can share your faith with others, express your religious ideas, and speak about your beliefs without fear of persecution. The right to practice involves performing religious rites, worship, ceremonies, and any other activities that express one's religion. This could include following rituals, participating in prayers, or celebrating religious festivals. Thirdly, the right to propagate enables individuals to share their religious beliefs with others. While this means teaching and discussing one's religion, it is important to note that this does not include the right to convert someone forcefully to one's own religion. Forcing someone to change their beliefs is considered a violation of their freedom of conscience, which is protected for everyone. Article 25 is comprehensive as it not only addresses personal beliefs but also the practices that come with those beliefs. Importantly, these rights are extended to everyone in India, including non-citizens, ensuring that all individuals can enjoy these freedoms. However, these rights are not absolute. They are subject to limitations that ensure public order, morality, and health are maintained. This means that while individuals have freedom of religion, their practices cannot harm others or disrupt societal harmony. The state has the authority to regulate certain aspects of religious practices. For example, it can impose rules regarding economic, financial, or political activities linked to a religion. Additionally, the government can promote social welfare and reform, particularly within Hindu institutions, making them accessible to all groups and sections of the Hindu community. In addition to these rights, Article 25 provides specific explanations. One of them clarifies that for Sikhs, the right to carry and wear kirpans, a ceremonial sword, is considered part of their religious practice. Another explanation states that in the context of Hinduism, the term Hindus also includes Sikhs, Jains, and Buddhists, recognizing the diversity within these faiths. In summary, Article 25 of the Indian Constitution establishes and protects the right to freedom of religion, allowing individuals to believe, practice, and share their faith while ensuring respect for public order and the rights of others. This reflects India's commitment to upholding the fundamental right to religious freedom for all its citizens and residents. Freedom to manage religious affairs in India. In India, the freedom to manage religious affairs is protected by Article 26 of the Constitution. This article gives certain rights to religious groups or denominations, which are communities that share similar beliefs and practices. Here's a breakdown of the core rights given under Article 26. Firstly, religious denominations have the right to establish and maintain institutions for religious and charitable purposes. This means that they can set up places of worship, prayer halls, or organizations that aim to help those in need, such as orphanages or hospitals financed through donations and religious contributions. Secondly, they have the right to manage their own affairs when it comes to matters of religion. This allows these groups to decide how they want to conduct their religious practices, rituals, and governance without interference from the state. In addition to management and establishment rights, religious denominations also have the right to own and acquire property, whether it's movable property like vehicles and furniture or removable property like land and buildings. Moreover, they can administer and manage this property according to the law, which provides a legal framework for how these assets can be utilized. While Article 26 protects the rights of religious groups, it is important to note that these rights are subject to certain limitations. Just like the rights provided under Article 25, which focuses on the individual rights of members of religious communities, the rights under Article 26 must respect public order, morality, and health. This means that while individuals and groups enjoy freedom of religion, their practices should not disrupt public peace or health standards. In interpreting these articles, the Supreme Court of India has established that a group must meet specific conditions to be recognized as a religious denomination. The court stated that the group must 1. Consist of a group of individuals who share a system of beliefs or doctrines that they consider beneficial to their spiritual well-being. 2. Have a common organization that facilitates their religious activities and governance. And 3. Be known by a distinctive name that sets them apart from other groups. For example, the Supreme Court has recognized the Ramakrishna Mission and Ananda Marga as religious denominations within Hinduism because they meet the criteria mentioned above. However, it ruled that the Aurobindo Society does not qualify as a religious denomination, likely because it does not have a specific set of doctrines or a common organizational structure as required by the court's assessment. In summary, Articles 25 and 26 of the Indian Constitution collectively ensure that both individuals and religious groups have the freedom to practice and manage their religions. They lay down fundamental rights while also clarifying the parameters within which these rights can be exercised. The intent behind these articles is to promote a diversity of faiths and beliefs, allowing each denomination to flourish according to its principles while being mindful of the broader society's needs and regulations. Article 27 of the Indian Constitution focuses on the freedom from taxation for the promotion of any religion. This article ensures that no individual can be forced to pay taxes that are specifically used to support or promote a particular religion or religious group. Essentially, the government is not allowed to use tax money to favor one religion over another. This clause is essential in maintaining the secular nature of the Indian state, ensuring that all religions are treated equally without any discrimination. In practice, Article 27 means that public funds collected through taxes cannot be utilized for the promotion or support of any single religion. This law is aimed at preventing the government from spending taxpayer money in ways that could give undue advantage to one religious group over others. It encourages the idea that the state should remain neutral in matters of religion, thereby reinforcing the secular fabric of the country. However, it's important to clarify that this article only prohibits taxes specifically meant for supporting a religion. It does not prevent the government from charging fees. Fees are different from taxes and are typically intended to regulate and manage secular activities concerning religious institutions. For example, a fee may be charged to pilgrims visiting a holy site, which can be used to provide additional services, security, or facilitation for their comfort and safety. Similarly, fees could be imposed on religious endowments, which would help cover administrative costs and ensure that these organizations operate within the legal framework. In terms of related articles within the Indian Constitution, Articles 25 to 28 also deal with freedom of religion, ensuring that every citizen has the right to freely profess, practice, and propagate their religion. Article 25, for instance, grants every individual the right to follow their religion, while Article 28 stipulates that no religious instruction can be provided in government-funded educational institutions. Together, these articles work to create a balanced framework that supports religious freedom while keeping the state separate from religious considerations. Understanding Article 27 and its implications can help realize how vital it is for a multicultural country like India to maintain a system that does not favor any religious group, promoting equality and harmony among diverse faiths in the society. This commitment to neutrality in religious matters is a cornerstone of India's democratic ethos, ensuring that every citizen, regardless of their religious beliefs, is treated equally under the law. Article 28 of the Indian Constitution addresses the issue of religious instruction in educational institutions. Essentially, this article states that if an educational institution is completely funded by the government, no religious instruction shall be given. This means that public schools cannot teach any religion as part of their curriculum. However, if an institution is run by the government but is established through a trust or an endowment that specifically states it should provide religious education, then teaching religion is allowed in these institutions. This creates a distinction that acknowledges the role of trusts and endowments in maintaining religious teachings. Furthermore, Article 28 protects the rights of individuals attending educational institutions that are recognized by the government or that receive government funding. It explicitly says that no student can be forced to take part in any religious instruction or worship without their own permission. If a student is a minor, the approval of their guardian is required for them to participate in religious activities. The article draws a clear line between different types of educational institutions. It can be categorized into 4 types. Institutions wholly funded by the government, where no religious instruction is allowed. Institutions run by the government but based on endowments or trusts that specify the need for religious instruction, where such teaching is allowed. Institutions recognized by the government, where participation in religious instruction is voluntary. Institutions receiving financial aid from the government, where again, participation in religious instruction is voluntary. In summary, Article 28 ensures that while the government-funded schools maintain a secular education system free from religious influence, there are provisions for religious teaching in specific circumstances, all while protecting the rights of students and their families to choose whether or not to engage with religious instruction. This article is part of the fundamental rights enshrined in the Constitution of India, reflecting the nation's commitment to freedom of religion and maintaining a secular state. Cultural and educational rights in India. Cultural and educational rights are essential for protecting the interests of minorities in India. One of the key articles that addresses this is Article 29 of the Indian Constitution. This article ensures that any group of people in India who has a unique language, script, or culture has the right to preserve and promote what makes them distinct. This means that if a group identifies itself by its language or culture, it has the freedom to maintain its traditions and way of life without interference. Moreover, Article 29 also focuses on educational rights. It states that no citizen can be denied entry into any school or educational institution supported by the government just because of their religion, race, caste, or language. This provision is significant because it protects the rights of individuals, ensuring that everyone has equal opportunities in education, regardless of their background. The protections under Article 29 benefit both minority groups and individuals. For example, a small tribal community speaking a unique language has the right to keep its culture alive. At the same time, any person, whether part of a minority or a majority group, can seek admission to educational institutions without facing bias based on their community. Interestingly, the Supreme Court of India has interpreted Article 29 in a broad manner. It clarified that the article is not limited to protecting only the rights of minorities, as many people commonly think. Instead, it uses the term section of citizens, which includes both minorities and majority groups. This means that the protections offered by Article 29 are applicable to all citizens, ensuring a wider range of rights related to culture and education. Additionally, Article 30 complements Article 29 by giving minority communities the right to establish and administer educational institutions of their choice. This article protects the rights of religious and linguistic minorities to create and run schools that cater to their specific cultural and educational needs. In conclusion, Articles 29 and 30 of the Indian Constitution provide a robust framework for protecting the cultural and educational rights of all citizens, ensuring that everyone, regardless of their community background, can enjoy their rights without discrimination. This legal foundation is crucial for fostering a diverse and inclusive society where every group can thrive while contributing to the rich tapestry of Indian culture. Rights of minorities to establish and administer educational institutions in India. Article 30 of the Indian Constitution protects the rights of minorities, which can be based on religion or language, to create and run educational institutions that they prefer. This means that both religious and linguistic minorities are entitled to start schools, colleges, or other educational settings without interference as long as they adhere to certain regulations laid out by the state. One important aspect of Article 30 is its provision concerning the acquisition of property belonging to a minority educational institution. According to this provision, if the government needs to take over any property belonging to such an institution, the amount of compensation offered must not diminish the rights granted to minorities. This protection was strengthened by the 44th Amendment Act of 1978, which removed the right to property, originally laid out in Article 31, from the list of fundamental rights. Instead, it reinforced the rights of minorities regarding their educational institutions. Under Article 30, when the government provides financial assistance to educational institutions, it must do so without discrimination against minority-managed institutions. This means that educational institutions run by minorities should receive fair treatment when it comes to government funding. While Article 30 guarantees these rights specifically to minorities, it does not define the term minority within the Constitution itself. This has left some ambiguity regarding who exactly qualifies for these protections. Moreover, Article 30 allows minorities to educate their children in their own language, which is essential for preserving their cultural heritage. Minority educational institutions can be categorized into three types. The first type includes those that seek both recognition and funding from the government. The second type seeks only recognition but not financial aid. The third type consists of institutions that do not seek either acknowledgement or financial support from the state. The first two types are subject to the government's regulatory powers concerning various aspects such as curriculum, academic standards, student discipline, and the hiring of teachers. On the other hand, the third type can run their operations independently but must still comply with general laws of the country, which could include laws related to contracts, labor, and taxation. In a landmark case referred to as the Secretary of Malankara Syrian Catholic College case, in 2006, the Supreme Court of India laid down some fundamental principles about the rights of minorities to create and manage their educational institutions. Minorities have the right to choose their governing bodies, which are the groups responsible for managing the institutions. This choice should be based on trust and confidence. Minorities can appoint their own teachers and administrative staff, and they have the authority to take necessary actions if staff members do not perform their duties properly. They have the right to admit students of their choice and decide on a reasonable fee structure for those students. They can utilize their properties and resources for the benefit of their institutions. It is also important to note that the rights given to minorities under Article 30 aim to ensure they have equal opportunities compared to the majority community. They are not designed to promote reverse discrimination. This means that minority institutions must still adhere to general laws concerning national interests, public safety, social welfare, and health, just like any other institution. Furthermore, the right to establish and manage educational institutions is not absolute. This right does not permit any form of mismanagement. The government can impose regulations to ensure that the institutions maintain high educational standards and operate efficiently. Such regulations might cover aspects like student welfare, teacher qualifications, and curriculum development. For institutions that do not receive government funding, unaided minority institutions, they have the autonomy to choose their hiring procedures for teaching staff, provided they meet established eligibility criteria. The government may impose conditions on financial aid to guarantee that it is used effectively, but these conditions should not compromise the rights provided under Article 30(1). In summary, Article 30 of the Indian Constitution is a crucial provision that affirms the right of minorities to create and run their educational institutions while ensuring they maintain standards and comply with national regulations. It plays a significant role in promoting educational diversity and helps preserve the cultural and linguistic identity of minority communities in India. Constitutional remedies in India. The Indian Constitution includes important rights known as fundamental rights, which are essential for the protection of individual freedoms. However, simply stating these rights is not enough. There must be effective ways to enforce them if they are violated. Article 32 of the Constitution provides a way for citizens to seek remedies when their fundamental rights are not respected. Essentially, this means that having the right to protect your rights is itself a fundamental right. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who played a key role in drafting the Constitution, described Article 32 as vital, saying that without it, the Constitution would be pointless. It is what gives life to the Constitution, making it meaningful and functional. The Supreme Court of India has stated that Article 32 is a basic feature of the Constitution, meaning it cannot be removed or changed through amendments to the Constitution. Article 32 has four main provisions. First, it guarantees that individuals can approach the Supreme Court to enforce their fundamental rights through the necessary legal proceedings. Second, the Supreme Court is granted the authority to issue various types of orders or writs to uphold these fundamental rights. The types of writs include habeas corpus, which protects against unlawful detention, mandamus, which compels a government official to perform their duty, prohibition, which prevents a lower court or authority from acting beyond its powers, certiorari, which allows higher courts to review the decisions of lower courts, and quo warranto, which checks the legality of a person's claim to a public office. Third, Parliament has the power to allow other courts to issue orders and writs to protect fundamental rights, but this cannot diminish the powers granted to the Supreme Court. Through Article 226, High Courts are already granted similar powers, allowing them to issue writs for the protection of fundamental rights. Fourth, the right to approach the Supreme Court for the enforcement of fundamental rights cannot be suspended unless specifically allowed by the Constitution. During a national emergency, the President has the power to suspend this right as per Article 359. Thus, the Supreme Court serves as the protector of citizens' fundamental rights. The court has both original and wide powers, meaning a citizen can directly approach the Supreme Court without needing to go through lower courts first. Moreover, its powers are broad and not limited to issuing only orders or instructions. It can issue various writs to protect rights. The primary aim of Article 32 is to provide an easy, fast, and efficient way to resolve issues related to fundamental rights. However, it is important to note that Article 32 can only be used to enforce the rights that are classified as fundamental. It cannot be used to address violations of other types of rights, such as those rights granted by legislation or customary practices. The violation of a fundamental right is essential for invoking Article 32. The Supreme Court cannot use this article to determine issues unrelated to fundamental rights. While the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction, it does not have exclusive jurisdiction under Article 32. This means that aggrieved individuals also have the option to approach a high court directly to resolve issues concerning their fundamental rights under Article 226. Importantly, since the right to approach the Supreme Court for the enforcement of fundamental rights is itself a fundamental right, having alternative routes available does not prevent individuals from seeking relief through Article 32. However, the Supreme Court has advised that individuals should first approach the High Court in cases where relief is available there under Article 226. In summary, Article 32 is a crucial aspect of the Constitution that not only guarantees the protection of fundamental rights but also establishes a direct and powerful mechanism for ordinary citizens to seek justice against violations of these rights, reinforcing the notions of equality and justice within the framework of Indian law. Writs in the Indian Constitution, Types and Purpose. In India, the Constitution provides the power to issue writs, which are legal orders meant to protect individuals' rights and ensure justice. The Supreme Court, as stated in Article 32 of the Constitution, and the High Courts, as mentioned in Article 226, have the authority to issue 5 specific types of writs: habeas corpus, mandamus, prohibition, certiorari, and quo warranto. The Parliament has the potential to give this power to other courts, but no such authority has been designated yet. Therefore, for now, only the Supreme Court and High Courts can issue these writs. Before the Constitution came into effect in 1950, only the High Courts of Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras had the ability to issue writs. However, Article 226 broadened this power, allowing all high courts in India to issue writs. These writs have their origins in English law, where they are known as prerogative writs. In England, they were issued as part of the king's authority, reflecting the idea that the king was the ultimate source of justice. Over time, high courts started to use these writs as special remedies to protect the rights and freedoms of the people. The writ powers of the Supreme Court and the High Courts have some key differences. Firstly, the Supreme Court can only issue writs to enforce fundamental rights, which are the basic rights guaranteed to all citizens. In contrast, High Courts can issue writs for enforcing fundamental rights and for other legal rights. This means that the Supreme Court's jurisdiction regarding writs is more limited compared to that of the High Courts. Secondly, the geographical scope of writs is different for each court. The Supreme Court can issue writs against any person or government throughout the entire country. On the other hand, High Courts can only issue writs against individuals or authorities located within their own regions, unless the case relates to an issue that occurred in their jurisdiction. Thirdly, there is a critical distinction regarding the nature of the writs issued. The right to approach the Supreme Court under Article 32 to seek a writ is itself considered a fundamental right, meaning that the Supreme Court is obligated to hear these cases. In contrast, the ability to seek a writ from a High Court under Article 226 is discretionary, which means that a High Court has the option to refuse a writ application if it sees fit. In summary, Articles 32 and 226 of the Indian Constitution empower the Supreme Court and High Courts to use writs as tools for justice. The Supreme Court serves as a protector of fundamental rights, while High Courts also play a broader role in enforcing legal rights. Understanding these writs and their implications is essential for grasping the legal framework in India that protects citizens' rights and ensures accountability from the government. Now let's take a closer look at the types of writs mentioned in these articles and their significance. 1. Habeas corpus. This writ is used to ensure that a person who has been detained or imprisoned can challenge the legality of their detention. It protects individual freedom by ensuring that no one can be held without just cause. 2. Mandamus. Mandamus is a writ issued by a court to command an individual or a government official to perform a specific act that is mandated by law. This is often used to ensure that public officials carry out their duties. 3. Prohibition. This writ is issued by a superior court to prevent an inferior court or tribunal from acting outside its jurisdiction. It serves to stop authority figures from making unlawful decisions. 4. Certiorari. This writ allows a higher court to review the decisions made by lower courts or tribunals. It ensures that legal proceedings are conducted fairly and within the bounds of the law. 5. Quo warranto. This writ is used to question the authority of a person holding a public office. It ensures that only those elected or appointed legally can hold such positions. Understanding these various writs enhances one's awareness of the legal mechanisms available to uphold justice in India. They are crucial tools for individuals seeking to protect their rights and seek remedies from the courts. Understanding habeas corpus in the Indian legal system. Habeas corpus is a Latin phrase that translates to, "You shall have the body." In simple terms, it refers to a legal order issued by a court that requires someone who has detained another person to bring that person before the court. This process allows the court to look into why the person has been detained and to determine if the detention is legal. If the court finds that the detention is unlawful, it can order the immediate release of the person who has been held. This writ is well known for protecting individual freedom and is seen as a crucial safeguard against arbitrary or unlawful detention. It is a powerful tool that helps ensure that nobody can be held in custody without sufficient legal reasons. In India, the writ of habeas corpus can be directed towards both government officials and private individuals who may be holding someone against their will. The legal framework surrounding habeas corpus in India is rooted in Article 32 and Article 226 of the Indian Constitution. Article 32 provides individuals the right to move the Supreme Court for the enforcement of fundamental rights, while Article 226 empowers the High Courts to issue writs, including habeas corpus, for the protection of legal rights. These provisions reflect the importance of individual liberties in the Indian legal system and affirm the judiciary's role in checking unlawful detention. However, there are specific circumstances under which the writ of habeas corpus cannot be issued. For example, if the detention is lawful, meaning that it is supported by valid legal reasons, the court will not intervene. Similarly, the court will not issue the writ if the detention arises from proceedings for contempt of court or legislature, if the detention is carried out by a competent court exercising its authority, or if the detention occurs in a place outside the jurisdiction of the court being approached. Overall, habeas corpus serves as a vital legal remedy that underscores the principle of liberty and the rule of law in India. It acts as a protective measure against wrongful imprisonment, ensuring that the rights of individuals are respected and upheld. Therefore, understanding this legal remedy is essential for appreciating how the Indian Constitution seeks to maintain justice and individual freedoms within the framework of the law. Mandamus is a legal term that translates to, "we command." It refers to a specific type of order that a court issues to a public official or authority, instructing them to carry out a duty that they have either not performed or have refused to fulfill. This means that if a public servant is not doing their job properly, the court can step in and command them to do their work. The writ of mandamus can also be directed at various entities, including government bodies, local corporations, lower courts, or tribunals. The aim is to ensure that official duties are completed as required by law. However, there are certain limitations on when mandamus can be issued. First, mandamus cannot be used against private individuals or organizations because this legal command is meant to hold public officials accountable, not private citizens. Second, it cannot enforce general departmental instructions or circulars that do not have the backing of law. These informal guidelines lack the same authority as laws written in statutes. Another limitation is that mandamus cannot be applied in situations where the duty in question is discretionary. If an official has a choice about how to carry out their duties, the court won't issue a mandamus to force them to take a specific action. Furthermore, this writ is not intended for enforcing contractual obligations. Situations that arise from agreements between parties need to be handled through different legal avenues. Mandamus is also not applicable when it comes to India's highest officials, such as the President of India or the Governor of a state, as they have certain protections in their functions. Similarly, The Chief Justice of a High Court cannot be commanded through mandamus while performing their judicial duties, as this would interfere with the independence of the judiciary. In the context of Indian law, the writ of mandamus is recognized under Article 32 and Article 226 of the Indian Constitution. Article 32 gives individuals the right to approach the Supreme Court directly for the enforcement of fundamental rights, and the writ of mandamus is one of the remedies available. Article 226 allows high courts to issue this writ for the enforcement of fundamental rights or for any other purpose. These articles uphold the principles of accountability and ensure that public officials fulfill their obligations, which is vital for the proper functioning of democracy. Understanding the limits and applications of mandamus is essential for both citizens and public officials. It serves as a reminder that while the law provides mechanisms for accountability, there are specific circumstances that dictate how and when these legal tools can be utilized. Prohibition in Indian law. Prohibition is a legal term that essentially means to forbid someone from doing something. In the context of Indian law, it refers to a type of order issued by a higher court to a lower court or a tribunal. The main purpose of this order is to prevent the lower court from either overstepping its boundaries, jurisdiction, or taking up cases that it does not have the legal authority to handle. Prohibition is specifically designed to maintain the rule of law and ensure that lower courts do not misuse their powers. Unlike another legal order known as mandamus, which commands a body to take a specific action, prohibition works in a different way. It specifically instructs a court or tribunal not to proceed with a certain action or case. This distinction is important within the legal framework because it highlights how different types of writs function within the judiciary. In India, the writ of prohibition can only be issued against judicial and quasi-judicial authorities. These authorities include courts and tribunals that make decisions based on law, but it cannot be directed against administrative authorities, legislative bodies, or private individuals and organizations. This limitation ensures that the judiciary maintains control over its own workings without interfering in administrative functions or legislative processes. The legal basis for the writ of prohibition in India can be found in Article 32 and Article 226 of the Constitution of India. Article 32 provides individuals the right to approach the Supreme Court for the enforcement of fundamental rights, while Article 226 allows individuals to seek remedies from high courts. Both provisions enable the judiciary to issue various writs, including prohibition, which plays a vital role in safeguarding the rights of individuals and ensuring justice. In addition to these articles, the significance of prohibition is also echoed in landmark judgments where the courts have exercised their powers to issue such writs. These cases underscore the judiciary's commitment to preventing overreach and maintaining the integrity of the legal system. In conclusion, the writ of prohibition is an essential tool in Indian jurisprudence aimed at safeguarding judicial processes. By preventing lower courts and tribunals from exceeding their jurisdiction, prohibition helps uphold the rule of law and ensure that justice is administered fairly and within the confines of established legal authority. Understanding its role and limitations is crucial for anyone interested in Indian law and governance. Understanding certiorari in the Indian legal system. The term certiorari literally means to be certified or to be informed. In the context of law, it is a special type of order that a higher court issues to a lower court or tribunal. This order directs the lower court to cancel or set aside its decision in a particular case. Essentially, certiorari helps ensure that legal mistakes made by lower courts can be corrected. In India, certiorari is used when there are issues related to the power of the lower court. It can be issued if the lower court has acted beyond what it is allowed to do, known as excess of jurisdiction, or if it did not have the authority to make a decision on the matter, referred to as lack of jurisdiction. Thus, Certiorari belongs to a group of legal orders known as jurisdictional writs, which are meant to protect the rights of individuals against wrongful actions by courts or tribunals. It's important to note that there are differences between certiorari and another type of jurisdictional writ called prohibition. While certiorari is issued after a lower court has made a final decision, allowing the higher court to review and possibly overturn that decision, prohibition is issued before a decision is made. The purpose of prohibition is to stop the lower court from proceeding with a case where it might be acting outside of its authority. In India, certiorari is specifically limited to judicial and quasi-judicial authorities. This means it can only be used against courts and certain specialized bodies that make legal decisions, rather than against administrative authorities, like government departments or legislative bodies, which create laws. Likewise, certiorari cannot be sought against private individuals or organizations. The legal foundation for certiorari can be found in Article 32 and Article 226 of the Indian Constitution. Article 32 gives individuals the right to approach the Supreme Court for the enforcement of their fundamental rights, which includes seeking certiorari. Article 226 allows high courts to issue orders and writs, including certiorari, for the enforcement of legal rights. In summary, certiorari is a crucial tool in the Indian legal system that helps maintain the rule of law by allowing higher courts to intervene when lower courts exceed their authority or make mistakes. It ensures justice by providing a remedy for those who may have been harmed by improper legal decisions. Understanding this writ is essential for anyone studying Indian law or who might find themselves navigating the legal system. Quo warranto, understanding its significance. The term quo warranto translates to by what authority in Latin. It is a legal tool used within the Indian judicial system to question the legitimacy of an individual claiming a public office. In simpler terms, if someone takes on a public position without the proper authority or qualifications, a quo warranto can be issued to verify if that person has the right to hold that job. This process is crucial as it helps to prevent wrongful seizure of public roles by individuals who do not have the legal backing to do so. A quo warranto writ can be issued regarding a substantive public office, which refers to official roles created either by laws known as statutes or directly by the Constitution itself. These offices typically have a permanent status and involve significant responsibilities. For example, positions like judges, governors, or members of statutory bodies fall into this category. However, a quo warranto cannot be issued for ministerial or private appointments, meaning it won't apply to roles that are temporary or do not have a statutory basis. The interesting aspect of this legal process is that anyone who is concerned about the misuse of public office can bring a case for a quo warranto, not just the person wrongfully ousted from their position. This allows for a more robust public accountability mechanism. In India, the right to issue a quo warranto is rooted in the Constitution. Article 226 gives the High Courts the power to issue various writs, including quo warranto, if it is necessary to enforce any fundamental rights or for any other purpose. Moreover, Supreme Court articles such as Article 32 also allow individuals to seek the enforcement of their rights and can include issuing a quo warranto. By safeguarding the framework of public office, quo warranto plays a vital role in promoting transparency and holding individuals accountable for their actions. This ensures that public positions are filled by qualified individuals who are duly authorized, thereby upholding the integrity of public service in India. The existence of such legal measures is fundamental to a functioning democracy, ensuring that public roles are not exploited or misused by unauthorized individuals. Armed Forces and Fundamental Rights in India. In India, Article 33 of the Constitution gives power to the Parliament to limit or even take away some fundamental rights of people in the armed forces, as well as those in police forces, paramilitary forces, intelligence agencies, and similar organizations. This article is important because it helps maintain good order and discipline among these members and ensures that they can perform their jobs effectively. The reason behind this provision is primarily to ensure that the members of the armed forces are disciplined and can focus on their duties without distractions that might arise from exercising certain rights. It's essential for the armed forces and allied organizations to act efficiently, especially in critical situations that require immediate action. One key point to understand is that only Parliament, and not state legislatures, has the authority to make laws under Article 33. This is significant because it centralizes the power to regulate these rights and restricts state governments from interfering with the operations of the armed forces. When Parliament makes a law under this article, it cannot be challenged in courts on the grounds that it violates fundamental rights. This means that if laws are created that restrict certain freedoms for armed forces personnel, those laws are generally seen as valid and cannot be contested in the Supreme Court or High Courts based on fundamental rights. To implement Article 33, Parliament has passed several laws, including the Army Act of 1950, the Navy Act of 1950, and the Air Force Act of 1950. In addition, there are laws like the Police Forces Restriction of Rights Act, 1966, and the Border Security Force Act, which determine what rights members of these forces have and to what extent they can exercise their freedoms. These laws place certain limitations on fundamental rights, such as freedom of speech, the right to form associations, the right to participate in trade unions, and the right to communicate with the media. For instance, a soldier may not have the same freedom to express opinions or participate in protests as a regular citizen would, to ensure discipline and a unified focus on national security. It's also important to note that the term members of the armed forces isn't limited to just combat personnel. It also includes non-combatant support staff like barbers, carpenters, cooks, security guards, and tailors. This broad definition is aimed at including all individuals who contribute to the functioning and readiness of the military. Additionally, laws made under Article 33 can specify that military courts, known as court-martials, are not under the J.